To say that our nation is in trouble, with our freedom fleeting and God's blessings turned to judgment, would be an understatement. As God told the nation of Israel in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 1 and 2, and then the latter half of verse 15, He said this, "If you obey me, blessings will abound and literally overtake you." Those are the words that God uses. Literally overtake you, like a horse on a rider to a pedestrian on a road. Literally overtake you. He said, my blessings will overtake you. Our founders knew these incredibly serious promises, and they wanted them. But God also warned. And they positioned, our founders did, they positioned themselves with great care because they wanted God's blessings. Sadly, in our generation, our citizens and leaders alike have thumbed their nose at God, His promises, and His warnings. With that, I welcome you to the program today. I'm Sam Rohrer, and I'll be joined in just a few moments by Pastor Isaac Crocket. Today's program is part 2 in our series, and it's principle number 4, the purpose of government. Now, as I said, this is the 4th in a total of 22 programs dedicated to laying out God's plan for a blessed nation. Another way you could say it is 10 principles America ignores to its own peril. Now, last week in part 1 of the purpose for government, we defined government and authority. We compared and contrasted. We identified God's design for government and the purpose for government. We'll build that out in today's program. Now, William Penn, from which a lot of these points were taken, actually took them off the pages of Scripture, but he incorporated them into his writings and his frame of government of 1682. Penn coined a phrase called the Holy Experiment in Freedom, where he said the world wanted an example. And he considered a critical aspect of this concept in his 1682 Frame of Government Treatise, which again, as I said, he took directly from the pages of Scripture. Now, in part, he said this. He said, quote, "Now this settles the divine right and purpose of government beyond exception, and that for 2 ends," he said, first, purpose of government, to terrify evildoers. Secondly, to cherish those who do well. He said, which then gives government a life beyond corruption and makes it as durable in the world as good men shall be. So that government seems to me, he's saying, William Penn is saying, a part of religion itself, a filing sacred in its institution and end. For if it does not directly, government does not directly remove the cause, being sin, and he referred to that elsewhere, he said it will crush the effects of evil and is as such, although a lower, talking about a delegated lower authority from God the Father, he said an emanation of that same divine power from God the Father. That is, God the Father being both author and object of pure religion. Really profound statements. Now, in essence, Penn was calling out what both the Apostle Paul in Romans 13 and elsewhere, and Peter in the Epistle of Peter and elsewhere says is the purpose for government. He said this, Scripture says, praise those who do well and punish those who do evil. That is the purpose of government. Now, Isaac, let's pick up again, and as we try to complete this principle number 4, because as we talked about last week, in Romans 13, in effect, government's purpose under God, having delegated authority under God, ultimately all responsible to Jesus Christ, is to enact justice based on the truth of God, which involves punishing those who do evil and praising those who do well. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. But just from the standpoint of broad application, this this applies to more than just civil authority, but all authorities. Last program you talked about the individual and families and church. Broaden this aspect of the importance of understanding in the enactment of justice, praising those who do well and punishing those who do evil. And you're a father, so apply it to you as a father.
Well, you said it, Sam. Justice is going back to God's truth, and it always works when we do it God's way. One of the most popular forms of marriage and family therapy, and especially used in schools with behavioral issued kids, is cognitive behavioral therapy. What does cognitive behavioral therapy do in essence? It praises kids for getting caught doing right, and there are punishments, consequences for when they do wrong. That's biblical. My dad did that with us, my brothers and I growing up. I try to do that with my children. We are motivated, yes, by avoiding punishment, but we are also motivated, and sometimes in a greater way, by being praised and appreciated. So punishment and praise can both work, but if it's only one and not the other, especially if punishment outweighs praise, it sometimes can kill the soul of the person. But yeah, the Lord's way is always right, and it always will be, now and forever.
Amen.
We're going to take a brief time out, and we'll be right back to discuss this area of government a little bit more.
Truth, flexible or permanent? The Bible, ancient history, or powerfully relevant? Culture, a reflection of enlightenment or warning signs? The pastor, commentator, or frontline combatant? Every day, American Pastors Network speaks to these questions where and when they matter. With hundreds of affiliate radio stations nationwide, a website and mobile app screening today's headlines through the twin lenses of the Bible and the Constitution, educating, informing, equipping. This is the American Pastors Network. The time is now to stand in the gap for truth.
Isaac, just before we went away for the break, I asked you to kind of explain the importance and a practical perspective of doing what Scripture says. Romans 13, 1 Peter talks about the purpose of authority, government. You described it earlier. Authority is really kind of the concept of ordered authority. Government we could put in the sense of more of the structure to make it happen. But all these principles that we're talking about, God laid out. Every one of these principles we've talked about: integrity, the character and the nature of God, the sinful nature of man, to now the purpose of government. God connected all of these. Our founders understood this, and they went right to this heart. As I read in the introduction to the program, William Penn cited and quoted passages right from Peter and Romans, and he used the words purpose for ordered authority, the structure of a government, which you brought in to be any authority of authority that God has established, was to, he said, terrify evildoers. The Scripture uses the word punish those who do evil. He actually went further and terrify those who do evil as a part of enacting the justice of God, which is ultimately the major purpose for authority, including civil authority government. So I'm just going back to you. I set that up and took a long time explaining that. But describe, if you could, in a little bit more clear terms, what does it mean to terrify evil doers, and why is that important in the process of an ordered God in an ordered society by a delegated, ordered authority called government? Why is it important to terrify the evildoer?
Well, Sam, you and I both have to drive on highways to get here to the studio for our recordings, and we've probably experienced it, and you see it if you're driving down the highway and all of a sudden there's a state trooper in the median. There's a literal knee-jerk reaction, like literally my foot just, whoop, hits the brake, even if I'm not speeding, because there's this terrifying feel about getting a ticket. And there should be consequences. Sometimes when somebody is getting in trouble, they say, put the fear of God in them. That's what authorities should do. They should take their God-given authority and pass that on to those who are evildoers, who are doing wrong. We are made in the image of God, so we have a conscience because of that, made in God's image. And so God gives the authority to those who are over somebody, whether it's a parent or a teacher of a classroom, a pastor, or a law enforcement, or a person making the law, to enforce God's truth, God's justice. And if we are being unjust, God talks about those who take advantage of the widows and the fatherless and things, we should be scared that God's authority will come after us. It should be terrifying. But it shouldn't just be terrifying. Again, Peter, said that we submit ourselves. He says that as unto governors, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God. This is literally God's will for government to terrify or to punish evil, but to praise the good. What could you maybe go on to what we talked about terrifying that William Penn used, but he also talks about cherishing. The government needs to cherish those citizens who do well.
Isaac, I can, and I'm just going to draw, if I can, upon since we're more specifically zeroing in on civil authority in this regard, although we tried to make the application applies to every aspect of authority. There is, as you just started the program, fathers and mothers. Ultimately, let's do it this way, come back this way. Ultimately, God's design is for an orderly society. He had to put into place, into a sinful society, things called laws. We're going to talk about that next week on the program, The Purpose for Law. But government administers laws. Authority has to administer on whose behalf? Ultimately, well, that should take us back to God Himself. So it's interesting that in this passage of Romans 13, those in positions of authority are referred to as ministers of God. That's the Greek word diakonos. It's where we get deacon from. It's servant. So when God called me in 1992 to step into civil government, I stepped in as a minister of God. Now, I was already a deacon in my church, but then I became a deacon in this thing called civil authority. God is trying to communicate the fact, as we described in the last program, He delegated authority. The father and the mother, the individual, those in public office, those in church government, all share one thing in common, and that is that they all are going to give an account to God.
That's right.
And when anyone in a position of authority, Isaac, properly administers justice, they will in everything they do not only be, well, kind of like the image of, as you said, the policeman on the corner, and you say, wait a minute, even though you did anything wrong, it's a reminder that there is a law that's bigger than you. And you say, all right, I better, that's accountability. Every person in a position of authority, a child should view their parents that way, not as some mean ogre, but they do have to answer to them. And if a father and mother has not enacted a respect for authority, they've failed, and that child is going to be rebellious. Well, same thing in civil authority and so forth. But a part of the enacting of justice as a minister of God, deacon, is to always say, how do I magnify my superior? That's God. So how do I, as a mom or a dad, how do I in civil government, in doing what I'm supposed to do by God's purposes, enact justice, how do I point that person beneath me to the fact that they will ultimately have to answer to a higher authority? If that person in civil government has not himself submitted to God as authority, he will not be able to communicate properly to those underneath of him, because God's purpose, they say, you are there because I put you there. Now, so the punishment becomes easy. You break the law, you want to throw you in jail, right? We talked about that last week, and that's what and a person who is about to break the law ought to fear encountering the judge. He says, you're going to go to jail or whatever. But you asked me the question, the praising of those who do well. The praising of something of those who do well is really key, not just in our family, but also in regular government. When I was in office, I purposely tried to, as an example, look for people in my district. And I had people looking, and my staff, when they would go out, we'd look for somebody who we may saw walking along the street, and when nobody was looking, just pick up trash. Or if we'd find of someone who helped their neighbor, a widow who may be in need, and they took food over to them, and we found out, I tried to take their names and put them out there and held them up as someone to be praised, because it was behavior that was becoming of God. It was appropriate. On the other hand, a person in office as a minister of God, Isaac, if they're really praising those who do well, they would not make any law that would be punitive to the person who does his best. For instance, taxation. I'll be real practical as we try to wrap it up here. Bad law can discourage people from working. Working is a good thing. But if you tax somebody and take away all of their money and taxes, it encourages them to be lazy. Well, that's an example of you praise those who do well. You compliment, you reward those who work hard by not taking away their money and taxes, as an example. There's a host of ways we can approach this, Isaac, so I'm just going to leave it at that right now.
And those all make sense because those are founded on the Bible, and of course it makes sense. God is the God of order,
absolutely,
of justice. And what's interesting is a lot of this that you're getting in the 10 steps to national renewal, we're going to the Bible for it, but it's really coming from William Penn, one of the oldest writings that we have for our nation, coming from him. Are there more areas that William Penn that you want to share with us that we have time for maybe that affect and impact what we know about this?
I do, and I'm not going to read all of it, but just some of them, because in Penn's Frame of Government 1682, and again, I don't lift him up as a person singularly, but I do lift him up as someone who thought through God's Word. And he laid out biblical principles, and these things we're going over are some of them. Now, here's a couple of them that he commented, and think of these in terms of the principles we've already dealt with. He said, first of all, men side with their passions against their reason, and their sinister, sinful interest have such a strong bias upon their minds that it leans them against doing the good things that they know. Well, that's what the human nature does, sinful, right? So he talked a lot about that. And then he went on and said, I don't find a model in the world of government that at some time and place in some singular emergencies have not necessarily been altered. He said, nor is it easy to frame a civil government that serves all places alike. He said, as I looked around the world, God didn't say that there was only one form of government, that there was a king or there was no king. He said in some places certain forms of government ruled. He said during his time, he said there are some people who like monarchy, they like aristocracy, they like democracy. Some like the rule of one, some like the rule of a few, some like the rule of many. And he said, but whatever it is, it ought to be free to the people where the laws of God rule. Isn't that great? And people are a party to those rules. He said anything other than that becomes tyranny. And then he goes on and he says, I know that some people say, let us have good laws, and it doesn't make any difference for the type of men that execute them. He said, but let them consider that though good laws do well, good men do better. For good laws may lack good men, and they may be abolished or invaded by ill men. Bad men will get in and change them. But he said, but good men will never lack good laws, nor will they allow bad ones to exist. He said, it's true. Good laws have some awe upon ill ministers, those in office. Romans 13 was talking about ministers of God. He said, but that is where they have no power to escape or abolish them. And the people are generally wise and good. He said, but here, a loose and depraved people love laws, and an administration of those laws, they like them like themselves. Therefore, he said, if you want a good constitution, a good frame of law, you have to keep it. And this is how. You have to have men of wisdom and virtue, qualities that because they descend not from worldly thinking, but from God above, must be carefully propagated by a virtuous education of the youth. And then he went in and said what a virtuous education was. It's what we'd call a Christian education today, where you learn to fear God and keep His commandments. Now, Isaac, these are men who studied hard what it was like when they had an opportunity to establish a new government. And they went first to the Word of God, and then they went into history. And that's what we're going over in these sets of principles. You can't beat God's Word. You do it the way He says to do it, and He says, I'll bless you so much that literally the blessings will overtake you. That's Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 2. We'll be back in just a moment.
Stand in the Gap is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV, positively different television.
Sam, I love when you read our founding fathers and those quotes that you were reading from William Penn. That was back, what, in the late 1600s?
That was 1682 that he wrote what I just shared in that last segment.
And it's so true to this day, of course, because it's based on the Bible.
And isn't it hard to believe, Isaac, that you have so many people today who say, don't bring God into this discussion. Our founders had nothing to do with God. You cannot read what they said without coming to the conclusion they knew personally. And I've read other things from Penn who gave his actual testimony in Jesus Christ. No, they knew full well. And that's why we're here today with still some blessings on our country.
Sam, that's what these 10 steps for national renewal, that's what it's all about. That's why God put that on your heart and why it's coming out. Can you tie up, this is point number 4. We're almost to the midway point. Can you maybe tie up the first 3 with what we've been going through the last couple of weeks, and maybe give us a hint of what's coming up next?
I sure can. This will be real brief. I'll just talk right directly here. So far, if you're just watching this program perhaps for the first time, we are on part 2 of the 4th principle of 10 that were identified by our founders, come right off the page of Scripture, but I've terming them God's plan for a blessed nation. So if you want to go back and you want to read the blessings that come that our founders identified, go to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28. Read that chapter. First 14 verses talk about the blessings of God. The last half talk about the judgment of God if people forsook who God was. Our founders said, we want God's blessings. I'm glad that they did, because otherwise we wouldn't be sitting here right now. Even in the midst of all of the trouble in our country, it's because they went through the process. Our founders did, and did what God said. The question is, will we reacquaint ourselves today in this time of confusion in our country and say, God has a plan. What is it? Well, we've looked at it so far. Choosing integrity, understanding the nature and the role of God, understanding the sinful nature of man, because that's a big difference. That makes a big impact. And then God's idea for authority and government, which we just went over now. And in next principle, next week, we're going to come back and we're going to move into the purpose for law, because if you don't have good law, just law, you can't have just government. They go together, And again, it all ties back in with what God says is the purpose for law and how that ties into justice. All these things we'll be dealing with in the weeks ahead. Thanks for watching us today. Pray for us in this series and beyond, that God will give us the ability to communicate truth boldly and accurately. And we are praying for you. Thank you for watching. Consider joining with us in prayer as a prayer partner, so very, very important in these days. And perhaps financially. We need your help financially as well in order to do the necessary aspects of communicating truth in this fashion across the country. Well, thanks for watching today. And again, may God's blessing be upon you as we share this truth. I pray that you would pursue the truth, that you would embrace the truth, and then you would stand in the gap for truth.